Hi, welcome back to Drunken Medicine, where we are drunk on medicine and passionate about whiskey. I'm Dr. May. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing for about 13 years, helping people, live a better life and help them get through struggles that have to do with like dysfunction and not necessarily just disease processes. So we'll get into that today as we talk about hypothyroidism. Mike?
Hey, so I am Mike. I'm an acupuncturist. I've been practicing for about 13 years also. And same as Dr. May, we both treated a lot of different patients with a lot of different conditions, including thyroid issues, and really helping people to be able to thrive, which we've talked about in other episodes, and not just kind of, barely get through life. And so we're really excited about talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge subject. It's talking about
Mhm.
thyroid dysfunction. So before we dive into that, we are passionate about whiskey. So, Mike, what are you drinking today?
Oh man, so I got something special. This is from the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. And they only give codes
Nice.
for this. So it's interesting. If you order from them,
Hmm.
it doesn't show the distillery, it shows the code. So this is number
Huh.
48. But I
Really?
looked it up, and it's actually Balmanac, which is usually only in blends, but they do some single cask stuff. So
Huh.
this is a 59% Speyside, so very sweet, very rich,
Yeah.
and very strong. So I'll be adding water to
Yeah.
it.
Nice. That
What
sounds
are you
really good. So
drinking?
why do they do the coding? What's the purpose of that?
So I heard originally they did it because certain distilleries didn't want off-brand things because they're basically taking these casks that
Hmm.
are off-brand, they're aging in themselves. They may be aging in different casks, they may be aging in different places for
Yeah.
different amount of years. And so they didn't want their brand to be associated, I guess, with any, I wouldn't say failures, but things that didn't match up with their brand.
Gotcha.
Um,
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So they decided to do the code numbers. You can still look it up, but then they aren't.
Yeah.
It doesn't have their name on the front of it, so you aren't
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, this wasn't up to Lagavulin standard."
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. Huh. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. So I'm looking forward to it. I added some water because 59% is a little stout.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Just a
bet.
tad.
I bet.
So what are you
All
drinking,
right.
sir?
So I am drinking what really introduced me to bourbon and whiskey. It was the first thing I had that was pretty good. That I thought, wow, I could get into this. Like this is
Mm.
really good. A
Oh, I'm
colleague and
intrigued.
I we were at a medical conference and it was like last night at the conference we go to the hotel bar and order. It's like, hey, give us a good sort of middle to top shelf whiskey, just something that's kind of nice to drink neat. And this is what the bartender gave us. It's called Basil Hayden.
Oh, good choice. I love Basil Hayden.
Yeah, it's a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. It's got this really unique taste of like brown sugar and pepper. So it's got this sweet spiciness to it. And it's great. I love it. I That's my go-to. That and Gentleman Jack are kind of my two go-tos when I want something just kind of middle shelf that's just great quality that I can sip neat. Yeah, so that's what I'm drinking today.
I've actually had Basil Hayden with you before at
Yep.
a work party, and we had a
Mhm.
lot of fun. It's really good. I think that was the first time I
Yeah.
ever had it because you told me you have to try this bourbon,
Yeah.
and I thought like this is really, really good bourbon.
It is, man. They've since come out with a couple of different versions. Now they have a rum finish one that is amazing. So,
Oh,
uh, yeah, I'll have to try that one at a later date.
I love the rum finish. The
Yeah,
rum finish beer, whiskeys in general can be really good.
yeah, they can. They really kind of take the bite out of it a little bit, so they're a little nicer to drink neat like this or over rocks or something. So,
That sounds pretty neat.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. He's already started, folks. Get
There
ready.
it is.
Buckle
There
in.
it is. You'll get to hear more, guys. Don't worry.
Please don't turn off the podcast just yet. I promise we're going to get some good info in here. All right, so let's dive in because thyroid, especially we're talking about hypothyroidism and dysfunction. It's a huge subject, and it's something that affects a large population of people, especially in the U.S., um, particularly women. But I mean, I'd say probably somewhere in the scope of 80% of the patients I
Wow.
see have some type of hypothyroid issue. Um, so, granted,
That's a
I'm in a specialty for endocrinology, but still, it's a vast majority of the people I see. So,
that's a lot. Oh my goodness.
yeah. Yeah. So before we dive into sort of dysfunction, let's learn how the thyroid is supposed to function in the
Hmm.
first place, so we can better understand dysfunction by learning what proper or normal function is supposed to be. So, like we talked about last week with testosterone, thyroid and many of the other hormones work on a negative feedback loop, which means that the brain is going to detect the level of that hormone in circulation, and then the brain's going to determine how much of the stimulating hormone to produce. So, in this case, from the pituitary gland, it's called thyroid stimulating hormone. That's a great name for that hormone because that's exactly what it does. It stimulates the thyroid gland to produce two main thyroid hormones, T4 and T3. Now there's some other thyroid hormones, but this is makes up the vast majority. So about 80% of what the thyroid produces is T4. The rest of it, or the majority that other 20% or 15 to 18% of it is T3. And now the difference between those two hormones is that T4 is it's not an active form of thyroid hormone. It actually doesn't do anything for your metabolism. When we think about thyroid hormones, we think about things that increase our metabolism, but that's not T4. That's T3. So our thyroid only produces a little bit of T3. So in order to get more, we can convert T4, the inactive thyroid hormone, into T3 in peripheral tissue, places like our liver, our gut, our muscles, and other places. Okay. So the reason why this is the case is T4 has a longer half-life, which just means that it can float around in your bloodstream for a lot longer than T3 can. So
Hmm.
it's kind of nice to be able to produce a bunch of inactive thyroid hormone and then be able to convert it to its active form when you need it, right? And then again, the brain, it feeds back to the brain, tells the brain how much is in circulation, and then we kind of create this circle again. Now, the issue is if your thyroid is not working properly, it can be stimulated by your brain all day long, but it's not producing enough T4 and T3.
Hmm.
That's what we call primary hypothyroidism. The issue is primarily in um, the thyroid gland. Now, this actually makes up a pretty small percentage of hypothyroid cases, especially in the U.S. This is not the majority of cases.
Hmm.
Um, the majority is at least 90%, especially in women, of hypothyroidism is caused by Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Now,
Oh wow.
this is an autoimmune condition where you're producing antibodies that attack your thyroid, and then your thyroid gets damaged and then can't function like it's supposed to. Now,
Hmm.
this is usually pretty insidious. It's a slow amount of attack over a long period. Eventually, it may take 10, 20, 30 years, but it'll eventually destroy your thyroid. And then that is a primary hypothyroidism at that point, where the gland is just not functioning and you have to be on medication, like replacement medication.
Hmm.
Um, there's some other forms of hypothyroidism. Really not going to go into those because those are usually a pretty small percentage of cases, but I will go into the peripheral conversion issue.
Yeah, I was about to
So
ask if there was conversion issues. That's what I was thinking.
yeah, so there's like the frank sort of disease where you've got attack on the thyroid, like with Hashimoto's, where your thyroid's just not working, or you've got pituitary damage and that's not working. But the
Hmm.
vast majority of what I see is this dysfunction. And this is where you don't convert T4 into T3 very well, or you can convert T4 into what's called reverse T3. Now, to go into that, I won't go into really the very minutia here because you can get sort of caught in this rabbit hole, and we could talk for hours on this. But
Hmm.
sort of the short of it is during periods of stress on our body, we can convert T4 into reverse T3. Now this looks really close or identical to T3, but it doesn't do what T3 does. T3 will stimulate metabolism in the cell. Reverse T3 does not.
Hmm.
Okay. So you would ask, why would we even do this?
Yeah, I
Why
agree.
would we why would we have reverse T3 in the first place if it's not, if it's actually not metabolically active? And the reason for that makes sense. If we're under stress, like if we're going through a famine or we're at war with the other tribe or whatever stress it might be, then it really does. There is some benefit to being able to downregulate our metabolic function to allow us to survive longer, and
Hmm.
that's what this comes into play. And so, if we have a way of when our bodies are stressed to sort of downregulate metabolism and we survive longer, then we pass that on to the next generation, and so on and so on. So this is as far as long as humans have been on Earth. This is kind of how we've survived. Now we
Hmm.
don't deal with, especially in the U.S., famine and war and stuff like that as much anymore. But we still have lots of stress.
Yeah.
You could argue we have more, albeit less, sort of intense stress, but chronic stress for longer periods of time. So this is how our body reacts to that stress because that's how previous generations have sort of evolved to kind of do that. So this is where testing, and we'll jump into this on the testing part in just a little bit, but this is where testing is really beneficial to kind of see what that whole picture looks like so
Hmm.
that you can determine where is the dysfunction here. Is it at the thyroid level? Is it at the brain level? Or is this a peripheral conversion issue? Or is it an autoimmune condition that we have to treat that way? So anyway, that's kind of the gist of how that thyroid negative feedback loop sort of works.
And I'm assuming that based on what you find in testing, it's going to change your treatment, which we'll talk about in treatment, I'm sure. But
Well, it does in the sort of dysfunction, functional medicine, naturopathic medicine sort of realm. Now, if you talk to, let's say, a conventional internist or an endocrinologist, they're not going to see it the same way because remember, they're looking through the lens of disease, right? So whether it's primary hypothyroid or Hashimoto's, they're actually going to treat that the same way.
oh,
Basically,
interesting.
you're going to be given Synthroid, which is levothyroxine, which is a synthetic form of T4, and then they're just going to monitor your TSH levels and make sure they're at a certain level, and that's basically it. So even though the disease process and that dysfunction have completely different root causes, right? You've got dysfunction of the thyroid, which is failing, and you've got autoimmune conditions on the other side that is causing damage to the thyroid. So those are two different processes going on, but they're treated the same way,
Hmm.
conventionally for the most part, because there is some evidence that Synthroid can lower some of the Hashimoto's antibodies, but in my opinion, it's just not enough. And we know that once someone has one autoimmune condition, they're much more likely to to develop another autoimmune condition.
Hmm.
So for
Interesting.
me, it's really helpful if we can try to get those antibodies down, try to reduce that autoimmune process as much as possible so they're not developing other ones in the future.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I'm curious from a sort of Chinese medicine perspective and thyroid and all that, like if somebody came in and said, I think something's wrong with my thyroid or I have these symptoms, like, I've been gaining weight and, I've been more fatigued. Maybe I'm cold or I have some cold intolerance. I can't warm up. Like, what would be sort of that strategy from the Chinese medicine perspective?
So it's actually quite interesting because, back in the day, thousands of years ago, they didn't know about thyroid issues in particular. They knew kind of the end. Like
Mm,
when you get to where it's really, really severe and you're having a lot of complication, you're having goiter, you're having all these different issues, that's where they knew about it. And so thousands of years ago, they were actually prescribing seaweed and seafood, like, 2,000 years ago,
mm,
and things that are very high in iodine for these kind of thyroid issues. There's talking about softening thyroid nodules, relieving edema, so getting rid of swelling,
mm.
helping people urinate more, that kind of thing. But they didn't really have a word for it as hypothyroid. Now it's a lot easier because usually it's done in conjunction with a doctor who's done testing. And if it's not, then I'll actually say, I would love to work with the doctor on this, a naturopath. If we're working together, it sounds like you could have a thyroid issue. I can still help you, but you should go see Dr. May and let's work together. But outside of that, it's funny because last week we talked about testosterone and kidney yang deficiency. And now we're talking about hypothyroid. And one of the main things that you're going to diagnose with is kidney yang deficiency. And this is something you're going to learn about Eastern medicine, is that you can have multiple conditions that are in the same grouping just because of the symptoms. And so you may have the same treatments that can help with different conditions because it's grouped under the same thing. So we're talking about glandulars, and a lot of the glandulars are under kidneys, kidney and some liver, but mainly kidney. But as far as treatment principle, when it first starts, let's say subacute, you don't really know, like there's no symptoms yet, to where the hypothyroid just starts to affect, and you're starting to get a little bit of weight gain, you're starting to get a little bit of fatigue, then that's just going to be a simple chi deficiency, which is like the top of the onion. It's like, okay, this is pretty simple. Let's start to treat it. And then as it gets worse, it gets down to the yang deficiency. So that fire deficiency, basically, where the movement in your body, the metabolism that should be burning, stops burning as much. And that's where you get some of the more severe symptoms. You get the, a lot more swelling. You get some hair loss. You get these other symptoms that kind of start to come in. And then as it gets worse, then you can get even worse, where you're feeling really, really cold and you just can't get motivated, and there's depression. So it's like if you start at the top layer with the chi, and then you get to the yang, and it just keeps going down until it affects multiple organs. And at that point, it just gets more serious. And so that's why I usually refer and work with other doctors, even though we can help, but you don't want it to get to those lower levels where it's like, okay, this is really, really serious now. You're going to, it's really attacking your thyroid. You have almost no thyroid function left, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. So, it's interesting that's the perspective there, because that's something that we kind of come back to with naturopathic medicine, where, there are sort of layers of dysfunction, right? And there's sort of like this process that most people go through. And sort of the longer that process goes on, sort of the deeper that level gets to of sort of dysfunction or disease state. And so to come out of that, you have to go backwards, right? So you're kind of backpedaling back through those previous steps that you went through to begin with. And sometimes that's really hard for patients to kind of walk through, and providers too, just because that can take time, right? To kind of walk through. If somebody comes to your office and they've been battling these issues for a decade or two, it's a little defeating to say, well, we're going to have to back out of this as well, and it may take several years to kind of back out of that situation, because it's taken a really long time to get you to this point. It's not going to change overnight.
That's a great
by
point.
giving you some herbs or medication or anything like that. So
I'm really glad you bring up that point, because so many people, they'll be at this lowest level that they've worked their way down. And they're like, Doc, I need you to fix me in 4 visits. And I'm like, I can't work miracles, man. You aren't going to have this completely gone in 2 weeks. It's just not physiologically, it can't happen.
Yeah, I struggle, because I even tell people, like, the way I kind of work through these issues is, hey, I'd say, give me 3 months. Let's work together for 3 months, make some significant changes, and let's see if we're seeing any progress, at all, any indication that we're moving the right way. Now, we're not going to resolve all your issues in 3 months. That's just not going to be possible, because most people that come to see me, they've been chronically sick for a long time. So it's going to take time. But if we can get a little movement, just a little evidence that we're moving the right direction, sometimes that can be enough motivation to kind of get them moving, further down the road.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And you also mentioned stress. I also wanted to bring up Eastern medicine looks a lot at stress and overstrain over a long period of time is affecting the kidney yang as well, because the liver is affecting the kidney. And in Eastern medicine, liver is basically upset with stress. And when I say liver, that's a more broad term. It's not just the liver, as we talked about last week, but it's a lot more. And it has to do with stress hurting your organs, hurting your body's ability to function optimally. That's really what I'm talking about here. And so that was actually one of the big things I looked at early on in this illness, is actually overstraining, too much stress that starts to go down this rabbit hole.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So again, this is really interesting because we're talking about the same stuff and the same approaches, just with slightly different language.
Yeah,
So
exactly. That's exactly
that's
right.
always fascinating to me. All right, so as far as diagnostic stuff goes, what kind of tools are you using to sort of to diagnose this? Is it the pulse diagnosis? Is it looking at their tongue? It's like what are some of the signs that you would normally see for someone who is hypothyroid?
So you mentioned Hashimoto's. So one thing that we would look at is kidney yang. A lot of times, if you've had an illness, some kind of, it's considered a cold illness in Chinese medicine, or something that could basically affect and damage your body. They look at it as what we would call autoimmune, where it actually starts the attack on the body. And so you would look at prior illnesses, prior things that have happened that may have started all this. Like, oh my goodness, I remember I've had these illnesses, and this is where everything seemed to start. And then things started to go downhill from here. And then you would ask further about, symptoms, and they would talk about, oh yeah, I feel cold all the time. My hair quality has changed. It's just like I used to have this lush hair, and now it's kind of coarse, and my skin gets really dry and doesn't feel right. My face gets puffy sometimes. I gain weight really easily, no matter what I do. It's like, oh my goodness, I mean, look at my diet, and they'll show your diet, and like I might fudge a little bit, but it's not bad.
Yeah.
They may have constipation, and so I hear all those things, and I start to think, kidney yang. I start to think hypothyroid, and then I check the pulse, and the pulse is usually going to be weak. It's not going to be very strong, especially in the kidneys. It's going to be deep. Kidney is the third finger, so if you're checking the pulse, 1, 2, 3. Third finger down. It's just going to be deep. It's going to be weak. On the tongue, it's going to be usually swollen. Can be pale. Can be really swollen. You think edema in the body. You also see that kind of swelling in the tongue with tooth marks on the side. That kind of stuff. Where I start to think, okay, from an Eastern perspective, thinking definitely kidney. But my mind is also going to the Western perspective. I think that there's a real possibility of a thyroid issue here. At that point, I would treat them for kidney yang. We talked last week about, the moxibustion, which I would do for warming as well, the acupuncture, which we can talk about in a few minutes during treatment. But then I would also refer to a doctor if they haven't seen their doctor, which a lot of times they haven't, because if they're coming to me, they don't want to see a doctor a lot of times. And so I'll explain, like, I'm not saying you have to go to a doctor you don't like. Like, why don't you see a naturopath? They're going to look at it from a different perspective. They're going to work with me. They aren't going to tell you not to see me. And at that point, I would usually reach out to, Dr. May or whoever I'm around and say, hey, let's collaborate on this case. I'm thinking hypothyroid. Here's what I'm seeing. And then they would make their diagnosis.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I say the same thing too. Sometimes people are coming to me for a different opinion or whatnot. And it's still, we have some very good foundational things that we do with medicine, no matter if you're an MD, a DO, or an ND. Like, there are foundational things and assessment techniques that we're going to use. So we don't want to bypass that just to look at a sort of different opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's really interesting with the assessment part.
How about
For
you?
me, it's yeah. So we oftentimes, when people they're gaining weight or they have a hard time losing weight, we want to immediately jump to, oh, something's wrong with my thyroid, right? And so it gets easily dismissed, especially with conventional medicine. Even in sort of my field as well, you see so many people come in, and you can tell right off the bat there's some other things going on, but we want to contribute. They want to work up their thyroid just to make sure, which I don't have a problem with. But you also want to look for other symptoms besides just, because weight gain can be a little ambiguous there.
Yeah.
So you want to look at the sort of deep tendon reflexes and their cold intolerance, and maybe they have some issues sleeping, or there's some hypersomnia. They're just tired all the time and want to sleep all the time. So there are definitely a lot of different symptoms that go along with this. And then you take those symptoms and you do some lab tests, and you see if both of those sort of say the same thing, right? So for me, I like to get a TSH, which is that stimulating hormone produced by the brain to stimulate the thyroid. So we want to make sure, is the pituitary working properly? And then get a free T4 and a free T3. Remember, going back to last week, a lot of these hormones that we make are bound to a binding protein. Thyroid's the same way. And so as long as it's bound to that protein, it's not free or active to do what it's supposed to do. So oftentimes we're going to look at the free levels of these hormones, and thyroid is one of those. So we're going to look at the free T4 and the free T3. Sometimes if I see that there's a lot of stress, that the stress component is there big time, I'll throw in a reverse T3 as well, just to see what those ratios are. And then especially if it's a woman, not that we're going to discount men in this situation, but it just happens. It's 90% of women that have hypothyroid it's due to Hashimoto's. So I'll always usually run an autoimmune panel, look at the TPO and the thyroid globulin antibodies. And sometimes we have to do this multiple times because autoimmune conditions are really tricky. The antibodies can go up and down. And sometimes if we're testing on a trough and we just there's not enough, produced that we can actually see on the test. And so sometimes if we still sort of suspect Hashimoto's, then we'll run antibodies more than once or twice just to make sure that that's not the case. Because I've definitely seen that happen before. I can almost guarantee, I think this woman has Hashimoto's. We run the antibodies, they come back negative, but then we do it again in 3 months and boom, there they are. So just do your due diligence there. That really tells us a lot right there. Is the thyroid working properly? Is that sort of negative feedback loop working properly? And then once we get a good sense of that, we can run other tests too to see like what's their iron status look like, because iron is a big player in thyroid function. What's their selenium and zinc and vitamin D and magnesium? Those are all nutrients that are needed for good thyroid function and for conversion of T4 to T3. So if someone has a nutrient deficiency, they're vitamin D deficient or whatnot, this can really affect their thyroid function and their conversions. So we want to make sure all those components are normal before we sort of proceed with that diagnosis.
That's awesome. And something I didn't mention when I was talking about diagnosis from my perspective is that there have been times that people come in really early on and they may not even know that they have thyroid problems yet and may not even have traditional symptoms yet. But I see some things that start to make me think that they may be going that direction, because that's something that's really good about Chinese medicine is prevention. And so I mentioned kidney yang deficiency as being the main thing. That's when you're really symptomatic. But I mentioned qi deficiency before that, so energy deficiency. So spleen qi, this is a big subject that I'm not going to jump into completely because we have lots of episodes. But in Chinese medicine, the spleen is not just the spleen. Like it's not just what we think of the spleen as Western medicine, as with most organs. It's also fluid and how your body moves fluid around, transforms fluid. And so if you see a spleen qi deficiency, which you can see if somebody gets really hungry, they start to get a little bit of weight gain, but not much. They may have a little bit of swelling here and there, but none of the other big symptoms that would point most people to hypothyroid. But sometimes it's right in the beginning. That's considered that top layer. And so if I see that, I can actually start to treat that, but also start to think they may be going down this direction, and it may still be like not symptomatic enough for most doctors to be able to pick up on yet or not pay attention to unless you're an acupuncturist or a naturopath. And so that's where you really want to catch it, is those top levels, because then it takes so much less time to reverse. And I know from your perspective, you definitely want to see somebody that's not so far down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, absolutely. And also understanding like what are some other components that could be contributing to this dysfunction.
Yes. Yeah.
Say like if a woman is getting into menopause, we know that her sex hormones are dropping, right? Her estrogen, progesterone, testosterone is likely declining as well. Those hormones play into adrenal and thyroid function as well. So imagine like losing all of these are really essential hormones. Now the thyroid and the adrenals have to, in a sense, take up the slack of those other hormones, and they have to do more work. So it's not uncommon to see a woman as she's gotten into menopause, say she hit menopause around 50 or 52, and then by the time she's in her late 50s, we start seeing some thyroid issues, we start seeing some adrenal issues, because she's gone almost a decade now without some
Mhm.
of these sex hormones or very low levels of those hormones, and that's affected her thyroid and her adrenal function as well. Same we can see with women that have irregular cycles. Maybe they have PCOS. They have a condition where their progesterone levels are low. Progesterone and thyroid function, they really work hand in hand as far as regulating receptors for those hormones. So we know that women who have low progesterone levels tend to experience more thyroid issues because of the effect it has on those receptors. So
Interesting.
yeah, it's just it all plays together, right? And so we can't just sort of parcel these conditions out necessarily, and say, oh, this one has nothing to do with this one, because most of the time it does.
Yeah. And I do have one more question before we move on to treatment, because I'm really curious about your perspective on this. Iodized salt, does it really matter? Does it make a difference? Because I know like there's a whole thing around sea salt, iodized salt, all this. Like, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, as far as thyroid conditions like goiters, which is usually due to an iodine deficiency, it does help. Like we don't see many goiters in sort of the Western civilization, after the exposure to iodized salt.
Okay.
Now that's becoming less and less nowadays. Now that we have sea salt and we just don't use as much iodized salt. But I mean, third world countries that don't have that exposure tend to have a lot more goiters that we see due to that iodine deficiency. So
Interesting. I was just
yeah,
curious what you thought. Yeah.
yeah, I wouldn't call it the best sort of source of sodium, but it's been pretty effective at decreasing the incidence of goiters.
That's awesome. That's really good to hear because, yeah, I've heard so many different things. I mean, on the internet, you see all kinds of things. So I've seen
Yeah.
like,
Oh, yeah. So
who knows?
I will say on the iodine, perspective, that people tend to go way overboard on iodine. There's
Hmm.
a lot of stuff out on the internet that you need milligram doses of iodine. We know that your thyroid only needs about 150 to 250 micrograms of iodine per day to function normally. That's a
Oh, wow.
microgram dose. Now we're seeing some people say, "Oh, you'll take 10 to 12 milligrams," which would be 10,000 to 12,000 micrograms.
It's a lot.
So yeah, and what that can do is it has a feedback to the thyroid. So if the thyroid sees all this iodine floating around, it's not going to make those hormones like it should. So people will see this increase in energy and they feel really good, and then they go complete opposite end of the spectrum and they create this hypothyroidism because they have too much iodine at that point.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I mean, you're right. The way we think now is like, well, more is better. Like if a little bit helps, then just
Yeah,
slam
yeah,
it. Slam it.
yeah, yeah. You'll shut down your thyroid pretty quick if you do that for too long.
And it goes back to balance.
All right,
Yeah.
so yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
100%. So we kind of covered assessment there. So let's dive into some treatment. So let's say we're working together, Mike. We have someone. Let's say it's a 35-year-old woman with Hashimoto's, and she's got some hypothyroid symptoms, weight gain, cold intolerance, things like that. What would be some strategy that you would take?
So acupuncture regularly, and a lot of people don't want to hear this, but I'm going to want to see somebody 2 or 3 times a week in the beginning
Mhm.
to really get things under control. I'm going to want them seeing you as much as you want to see them as well. But I want to see them frequently. I'm going to work on the kidneys. I'm going to work on improving metabolism, So yang, like speeding up yang, improving metabolism, improving energy. I'm going to work on fluid, uh, like fluid, making the fluids go down so if they have edema, draining that edema some. And so not only symptomatic, but just helping increase metabolism overall. And then there are Chinese herbs that have been shown in studies to be terrific for thyroid. So if they're not being seen by you or someone else, then I might prescribe those. If they are, then I would actually talk to the doctor that is prescribing, because like I said, you can have too much of a good thing. So if you're doubling up on things that do the same thing and they're synergistic, then you can run into problems. So if somebody's on some heavy duty stuff from their doctor, then I'm usually not going to prescribe a whole bunch of Chinese herbs, because I just don't know how it's going to interact.
Right.
But I am going to do acupuncture. I'm going to do acupuncture points on the ankle, which is along the kidney channel. It also helps with swelling. I'm going to do acupuncture point here for stress, but also for increasing energy. And then moxibustion over the lower stomach. So there's a point right in the lower stomach. I'm not going to show you on camera, but it's about an inch and a half above the pelvic bone.
Thanks.
And it is considered a very important point in Chinese medicine. It's a chakra in that system, but not in Chinese medicine. It's a burner point that basically is like a fire that you're heating. So you actually put moxibustion over that point along with the acupuncture, and it seems to help a lot. There's been some studies through the World Health Organization out of China that have shown in treating hypothyroid in Shanghai, they got a year of acupuncture, Chinese herbs, and moxibustion compared to the control group, which this would never happen in America. The control group got nothing. They had hypothyroid, and it's like, good luck, guys.
Oh,
it's like, good luck with it.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, the people who had the classical symptoms of hypothyroid were significantly improved versus the people who weren't. So, I mean, it made a big difference. So,
nice. I'm curious, when you're talking about the acupuncture, doing it pretty regularly, especially at first, what's the thought process behind that?
Well, I think that the body is amazing about healing. It really is. But at the same time, if you think about all the things we do throughout the day and throughout the week, if somebody comes in for an acupuncture session, they get this really good session, they feel terrific, and then they go back to work the next day and they get mad at their coworker, and then their kids, they have a baby who just pees all over their couch. And then they have like all this stuff going on. And then they go to McDonald's because they didn't feel like cooking, and they eat a double quarter pounder with cheese and a large fry and a giant milkshake. And then they go home and they get in their like half diabetic coma from that. And then they don't get good sleep. And then they go back to work. And think about that for a week, where you're actually doing all these things that can be detrimental to your health. And then you come back in and you're like, man, I felt better for a day. And then it went away and acupuncture didn't work. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if we were having perfect lifestyle, then I probably wouldn't need to see us 2 to 3 times a week. But I don't have a perfect lifestyle. I got stuff. I got kids. I got life. Mm-hmm. And so it's basically accounting for the fact that like we're having to counteract other things that are going on in life.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think it's a great approach. I'm the same way. Sometimes it just takes more nudge. It takes more accountability at first to kind of gain some momentum, which then leads to better motivation for that patient too, to do the things that they need to do to improve their health. Because with you and I, it takes a lot of, I don't want to say hand holding, but just kind of guidance at first, just to get people kind of moving the right direction. And so it's better to see us, more often initially in order to get that movement, headed the right direction.
Yeah. And I'm not blaming the patient at all, by the way, because you don't know what you don't know. It's like if you come in and you've never had a treatment modality, you've never had naturopathic medicine, you never had acupuncture, and you just come in and you're used to going to the doctor and they give you, 1 week's worth of antibiotics. It's like, take this for a week, 3 times a day, and then you're good to go. Like that's what you're used to. Right. And so it's a different approach for people to understand. Like when you do things naturally, it's going to be really good in the long run, but it takes time to build on that foundation. Yep. And you will see those results. It just takes a lot more time because you're doing it in a very different way. That's not pharmaceutical. So
right. I mean, a lot of this is changing lifestyle
Yep.
habits,
Yep.
and these are habits that people have had for years or decades. That's not going to change overnight. It's a process, that we have to kind of walk through. Plus, a lot of part of what we do is education, right? It's
Yes.
educating the patient what's going on with their health, and how do we change this? How do we improve this? And we can't dump all of that on them on the first visit, right?
Yes.
It's just like trying to drink from a fire hydrant. It's just not going to work, right? And so they're going to leave confused or just kind of beat down because they didn't understand all of what you went through. So we have to kind of piece that information out over several visits so
Yep.
they better understand like what's going on.
And that's also part of it too. I'm going to educate every single visit, and I'm going to talk about different things because, like you said, you can't just dump it all at once because it's too much.
Yeah.
And also, I want to give an example for seeing you actually, and not for hypothyroid, but you were my doctor also because I trusted you quite a bit, and you still are. I still trust you with my health. I mean, you're awesome. Yeah, I know. Don't blush. Don't get too excited. I'll bring you down there.
Well,
but I remember seeing you for the first time, and one question you asked me was really interesting. You asked me about like, how do I want my health to be? Like, what would optimal health look like for me? And I was like,
mhm,
no one's ever asked me that before. Like, no doctor has ever been like, oh, well, like what level
mhm,
of optimal health do you want to be? It's always like, okay, you have this terrible sickness. Let's help you not die and somehow get
mhm,
out of it and go about your your regular life. So
right.
for some people, your miserable life. I mean, people come in with all sorts of things. And so I think that that's a really good question. And I think from my perspective as well, it's like, yes, I may need to see you more often in the beginning. You may need to see them more often too, but we're helping them achieve a different level of health. It's not just skating by to not die. It's like, how can you
Mhm.
thrive? How can you be like at an optimal level where you have energy to do what you want with your family and your kids? And I just think that was a really good question. I'm glad you asked that kind of question.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, no, it's really important. If we don't have a really good idea of where's the goalpost, like what are we actually striving for, then we just kind of roam around and meander, and we don't have a sense of purpose to what we're doing. So trying to hone that in as much as you can and really
Yeah.
be as specific as you can as well, I think really helps people kind of move the right direction a little bit faster.
Absolutely. And back to the subject at hand, how do you like somebody comes in, you do the test, you find okay, you definitely have hypothyroid. Like what's your next step? What do you do as far as treatment?
Yeah, so I like to start with a great foundation, and so we talked about this in the last episode too. So starting with what I call the core four, which is nutrition, activity, sleep, and stress management. So those are sort of our pillars of health, right? So we want to start with nutrition. So let's say like they have Hashimoto's. Well, there's some good evidence that there's some people who have Hashimoto's have a higher incidence of gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. And so it may be a good idea at that point to get testing to look at food reactions and things like that. So that'll really help us to hone in their diet as well. If we know that they're having certain types of reactions to certain foods, like gluten and soy, and there's some of the kind of the big ones
That's
there,
awesome.
eggs,
Yeah.
oftentimes, because that reduces that immune load, right? So if this is Hashimoto's, we want to reduce that immune stimulus. So we want to take things out that are ramping that immune system up. And
Mhm.
food can often be that because we're eating every day, right? And there
Yeah.
can be other things, environmental toxins and things like that, that can have a play in that as well. But nutrition is just a really good place to start, and it's kind of low hanging fruit. If they have a sort of standard American diet, we can do a lot with nutrition to kind of get them move in the right direction, and they start feeling better faster by adjusting their diet appropriately. The other part too is activity. So this is a big part of thyroid function in general, is having enough stimulus to that thyroid. So if you're sitting around all day, if you have a desk job, there's not a lot of demand on your system, and your body is
Mhm.
not going to produce energy that it doesn't need. So if you're sitting around, you don't have a lot of need for energy. So sometimes it's just a matter of being fatigued because you're not generating much energy production because you don't need it. Your body's not going to produce, you say, 100% when you only need 30 or 40%, right? It's
Yeah.
just, it's not very efficient for our bodies to do. So part of that is just increasing the demand on your body. So the first part of that, if we look at this in sort of the metabolic equation, this is what we call the thermic effect of activity. And about 80% of that number is how active you are throughout the day. It's not exercise. Exercise only accounts for about 20% of that number.
Wow.
So when people think about activity, they automatically jump to exercise. And, well, I can't do 60 minutes of exercise per day, because my schedule's just too crazy. Well, that's only a small percentage of that number. So let's concentrate on the overall activity. Let's look at how many steps you get per day. That'll give us a general sense of what your activity level is. If you're getting 4,000 steps a day or less, you're pretty sedentary. You're not moving around a lot. So that's low-hanging fruit. That's a great place to start. Try to get their steps per day up into that 8,000, 10,000 plus mark. Once they do that, then we can start talking about exercise strategies and lifting and cardio and all those sort of things. But if you're not doing that already, if your level is at 4,000, we're not going to talk about, how many times you need to go to the gym. That's just not part of the conversation at that point. We got to get your overall activity level up. The other part is sleep. Again, this could be one of the biggest obstacles to just general function and health that you can have. So if you're not sleeping, well, that's huge. I think it's somewhere around 60% of American adults sleep 6 or less hours per night. That's just, that's baffling to me. So whether it's due to sleep apnea or if you have kids or whatever it is, like, you got to get sleeping better if there's a way to do it. Or maybe you're on shift work. Like we practice in Alaska. We see a lot of guys who work up at the mine, or they're working up on the North Slope. They have these weird schedules where they're on for, they're on days for 2 weeks, and then they have a couple of days off, and then they go to nights for a couple of weeks. And their schedule's always changing, and it affects their sleep, their ability to sleep for, uninterrupted for 7 to 8 hours a night. So that's huge. And then the stress management aspect, we talked about this a lot last week. Remember, when we're talking about peripheral conversion, that T4 to T3 conversion, if there's stress involved, that's really going to downregulate that conversion. And so whether it's mental, emotional stress or physical stress or whatever it is, we have to have good tools to help manage that. It's not that stress is ever going to go away, because I think things are just getting more and more stressful, but we can address how our bodies respond to stress. And that's where using techniques like meditation and prayer and deep breathing and guided imagery and counseling and all those sort of things can really help us get that better under control. So that's kind of where I first start, because most of this, again, is low-hanging fruit. It's a great place to kind of get things moving. These are actionable steps that people can start implementing right away. Once we kind of establish that, we can go into more of the specific things like, should this person need adaptogens at this point, or maybe a thyroid glandular, or maybe it's to a point where in order to get the ball rolling, we really need to put them on medication, because there's just so much dysfunction there that it's going to take forever for us to see the impact of these lifestyle changes on their thyroid function. And maybe not even at that point, maybe they're so far gone that we're not going to see that. So sometimes we do need to start with medication and see, one, are they converting? Are they converting their T4 to T3? Or maybe we need to throw in a little bit of T3 in there as well, just to help them function. Again, create momentum, which creates motivation. And that's how we get the ball rolling down the hill.
Yeah. And there's no failure if you need medical intervention. I always tell people that, like, it's not like there's a failure.
Right.
Because some people will feel like that. I remember when I was in Alaska, I had a patient come in that had a tumor, like a visible tumor, and they wanted to do it naturally. And I'm like, there's no failure in getting this removed, and we can still help you. Like, we can still work with you, but it doesn't hurt to get some more serious intervention and still get natural care.
Yeah. One of my first patients in Alaska, was a guy that had Crohn's disease, and he came in and he said, "Yeah, I actually urinated out a piece of lettuce."
Oh my goodness.
So he had
That's
developed a
rough.
fistula, which is a connection from his small bowel to his bladder. And so that because of all the inflammation and damage that was done to his small intestine, at that point I was like, all right, man, you got to get surgery first, and then
Yep.
we can start working on your issue because there's no level of herbs and natural stuff that's going to fix this fistula. You've got to
Yep.
get that corrected first before we can move on safely. So yeah, you're right. We're trying to establish the best medicine.
Yep.
Sometimes that's, starting with functional medicine, acupuncture, Chinese herbs, and things like that. Sometimes it's starting with medication. From my point of view, I think we overuse medications as first line therapies. Most medications are not meant to be first line therapies, which is what do we start with, right?
Yep.
Because lifestyle changes and things like that take so long, and they're arduous, and it's hard to kind of get things moving. But that's what we still should be starting with.
Yep. And we do tend to over medicate. I mean, you're right. Like, and a lot of times, if somebody has depression or anxiety, especially depression, it may actually be due to the thyroid, and then they may get an SSRI or something to treat their depression like it's the primary issue because no one ever went deeper. And so
Absolutely.
sometimes not only is it a medication problem, it's the wrong medication where it's like if you just help their thyroid, a lot of that depression would improve.
Absolutely, man.
Yeah.
100%.
And something else you said when you were talking about kind of the first line, I focus on diet as well. Processed foods. It's funny, Chinese medicine, you want to cut down on soy, cut down on wheat, sugar, processed foods. These are the things that we
Oh,
tell people with these deficiencies to cut down on. So,
yeah. No, awesome. Again, so much overlap there. I
yeah,
love it.
it's
It's
just so
just
cool. Yeah,
saying the same thing, just in a slightly different language.
exactly. I say it in a funny way that I get to explain. It sounds really cool and
Yeah, right. So, because hypothyroid and thyroid dysfunction is such a huge topic. I mean, I think we can kind of come back to different aspects of this. Today's show is just kind of an overview,
yeah,
generalization, of assessment and treatment and stuff like that. But we're happy to jump into more specific conditions if people want to. So if you're out there listening and you want more about this particular subject, let us know, and we're happy to do a show on a specific aspect of thyroid dysfunction.
yeah, absolutely. And we're just as curious as you guys are. I mean, you'll hear as we talk to each other, we have our level of curiosity as well, and so we're going to be curious about anything y'all want to hear about. We're having a blast. So
Absolutely. Like, this is so laid back. I mean, as you can tell with the name of our podcast, this is very tongue in cheek. This is just meant to be enjoyable, have a conversation. Eventually, we'll bring on some other experts out there and just talk, just get the conversation going about different things and see where it leads us. And that's what I'm looking forward to, because there's no expectation here. We're just having fun talking like
absolutely.
we would normally do if we got together, on the porch, drinking some whiskey and just talking about life.
Though I'm not drinking out of the bottle, so.
All right, Mike, anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank everybody for listening. This has been a great show, and thank you, Dr. May. As always, this is awesome.
Yeah, it's so fun. Thanks for the feedback that we've gotten so far.
Mhm.
It's been really kind of cool to see that feedback just on a couple of episodes. And again, like I said, we have no expectations here. We're just here trying to have some fun and talk about some really interesting stuff. So thank you.
Hey, thank you much, and
All right.
it's good to be here, and can't wait for the next episode.
All right. We'll see you next week. Take